A political campaign of any sort involves people working together for the express purposes of a political goal. That political goal can be to elect a candidate, enact a law, effect other change, or to sway public opinion to make any of these more likely to happen. Sometimes, in order to be effective, a campaign needs to maintain a specific level of visible conduct. If they're trying to elect a nice guy candidate, this means, say, avoiding making negative attacks. If they're trying to get a law passed that's against corruption, avoiding corruption yourself means people can trust your campaign to practice what it preaches, allowing for the cultivation of a basic level of trust with those they seek to convince and to vote for them. There is also an implied code of conduct in a lot of campaigns that discourages certain types of negative attacks, even if the campaign is engaged in negative campaigning. Violating this implied code can turn off even die-hard supporters if they are egregious enough. Even for a wild card or maverick campaign that bucks normal conventions and rules, there are still these soft limits to contend with. What more, when we're talking about the financing of campaigns, there are other limits to contend with. There are contribution limits and restrictions on who can contribute to a candidate's campaign and normal political action committees. There's also rules about reporting one's campaign funding sources very frequently. All of this was put in place to discourage political corruption and the buying of elections. Of course, with all these limitations in place, both in terms of funding and conduct, a campaign that is eager for victory might find itself wanting to go beyond them, to deploy tactics and resources it couldn't otherwise access without penalty or violation of the law. And that's where today's strategy comes in. How do you run a clean campaign that doesn't violate campaign finance laws and which has a high level of conduct, but which can also play dirty and or spend unlimited amounts of money? Easy. Run a shadow campaign. What is a shadow campaign? A shadow campaign is any parallel effort that has been cultivated or manufactured to operate in the interest of the cause or candidate you support, but for which the primary visible campaign can claim no responsibility for. Separate in day-to-day operation, but common in cause. There are a number of ways a shadow campaign can be built, operate, and exist. There is no one-size-fits-all listing of what constitutes a shadow campaign beyond the basics of existing in parallel to the main one and the ability to operate beyond the limits of the core campaign. But they can also be made up of independent grassroots movements, super PACs, having a rich billionaire friend spends lots of money championing your cause without you specifically talking to them during the campaign, or careful organization of surrogates that push the limits, but if they happen to push too hard, you can easily step back and disavow them and their actions and say, I'm not with that guy. That ability for the prime campaign to insist it is separate fully from the potential bad actors is important. It allows those attached to the prime campaign to avoid having to take responsibility and thus maintain their virtuous aura, even if, say, everyone involved in the shadow campaign has worked for the candidate in question previously, or they've been good friends for years, or the candidate has winked and nodded at the need to do something, while leaving out the specific calls for actions that would incite specific responses for the shadow campaign, being eager instead to see what their followers come up with as a response to the general call for action. That last one you may recall is how stochastic terrorism works. The most common form of shadow campaign in the present era is, of course, the super PAC, or Super Political Action Committee. A super PAC is allowed to take unlimited funds from basically anyone and spend that money however they like. The only requirement is that they have no coordination with more traditional candidate campaigns and the like. That means no sitting down and figuring out where they're going to be spending money to best work together. That doesn't mean the primary campaign can't, say, announce loudly that they're going to be increasing spending in this state or that district, because they think they could win there if they campaign hard enough. This public announcement can then easily be used by the super PAC to engage in extra spending in that same area, running complementary ads and efforts to that of the prime campaign. So because the prime campaign activities are so public, the coordination still happens right out in the open instead of behind closed doors. Sounds like they're skirting the law, doesn't it? Yeah, naturally. But it's this kind of trickery that lets shadow campaigns persist. What more, if a candidate is running as the man of the people type person, they can use any spending by super PAC that supports them as a tool to build that image. Condemning loudly this supporting outside spending and wishing so hard that they'd close up shop and go away. Because he really doesn't want their help. For reals, guys. In the current primaries, basically all the candidates have some sort of super PAC backing them. Yes, including Bernie Sanders. Now, super PACs are not the only type of shadow campaign. It isn't even the only type of officially sanctioned organization that can bend the rules to act in such a role. I mean, if you rail against super PACs enough, then having one supporting you kind of looks bad. So why not have a more generic nonprofit serve that role? And if they happen to violate the campaign finance laws, you can condemn them when people get around to noticing it. For example, in the current Democratic presidential primary, there is a fellow running by the name of Bernie Sanders, as I've already mentioned. Some of you may have heard of him, maybe. On August 24th, 2016, he converted his previous presidential campaign into a 501c nonprofit organization called Our Revolution. The official goals of the group include things like revitalizing American democracy, empowering progressive leaders, and educating on general political issues. Sounds fine and above the board, right? Never mind that as a non-political action committee nonprofit, it can get unlimited donations without being legally required to disclose where the money is coming from to the public. This means any communication generally about who has donated and how much can be limited to those who have been deemed acceptable to anyone outside the organization who might say, not like big dollar donors, but only mention the small donations and omit the big ones. This means for any general communication about who has donated and how much, they can limit it so that only the acceptable donations are mentioned. So no big dollar donations if you don't like that sort of thing. This might come off as a bit of a hit job on Our Revolution, but there is a little snag here. The problem is, however, that the existence of this organization as it is specifically the problem. The ability to operate in this fashion means that it can act as a dark money shadow campaign for Bernie Sanders, and yet no one's talking about it. Which kind of means it's working. It is operating as intended as it engages in electioneering activities, with the only reporting on the spending of the organization going to the contributing members, not the general public. And that's money going out, not money even coming in. So the people donating to the Our Revolution group there don't necessarily know who else is donating and how much. Now, there is one instance where they do need to disclose their contributors. It would be when they are advocating for the election or defeat of a particular candidate while spending $250 or more, and only those who contribute more than $200 during an election year. And they tell the Federal Election Commission this information. So if you're not actively for a particular candidate in a specific way, then you can avoid any reporting at all, even if you have a close alignment. Say if you are instead calling up people to support Medicare for all, one of Sanders' key campaign issues, and then leaving out who they should support to get that. If you're not advocating for a specific candidate, you're allowed to do this and skip all that silly disclosure stuff. But let's say that you are advocating for a specific candidate in your efforts, which might be the case with Our Revolution. I've never gotten one of their phone calls. When do you have to report? If I've read the law correctly, during an election year, it is quarterly, meaning the first time you report won't happen until after the first quarter of the year, which means after March. Anything from last year doesn't really need to get reported. So at the moment, we are sitting in a dead zone where a nonprofit like this can pull in as much money as they like and then spend as much as they like, and no one will get the reports on where that money is coming from until mid-April, after Super Tuesday. So isn't it weird how people rail against shadow campaigns that involve super PACs, but not this particular one? Again, this is an instance where a campaign of a candidate is trying to project a certain aura of behavior and acceptable campaign tactics, but due to having a shadow campaign, has the option to at the same time ignore the typical limitations of campaign finance law and pursue the campaign's goals, in this case electing Bernie Sanders. Now, you may be thinking, so maybe there is something schemy about this group in particular. But surely they're not at all working with Sanders' campaign. They're an independent group. Surely he can't be held responsible for their activities, right? Well, let us look at one of the national co-chairs of Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign, Nina Turner. Turner is one of the more well-known surrogates for Sanders. She is a former Ohio State senator who has supported him for some time now, and often shows up in articles involving his surrogate campaigners. She is also the president of our revolution. Huh. Fascinating. Seems one of the people running his official campaign also runs an organization that can take dark money and spend it to support his candidacy without having to tell anyone the funding sources until most of the primary is over with. I guess you don't need to coordinate between people if you run both organizations? I guess. Need more phone banks in Iowa? Then you get more phone banks in Iowa. From both official campaign and the Shadow Campaign simultaneously. Or from one or the other, depending on where the money is at the time. Which, some of it turns out, was indeed in the Shadow Campaign in the lead up to Iowa. Again, it is telling that this is never talked about, never brought up, especially in leftist circles, of which I frequent several. But all of this should be a big red flag that maybe there is indeed a less friendly Shadow Campaign working in parallel to the official Sanders campaign that is not completely above the board. But why am I talking about him in particular? Easy, because I don't like double standards for starters, which is clearly what's going on here. But also because it is a great example of how to hide a Shadow Campaign. Instead of going the traditional route to just have a billionaire fund a super PAC, or be a billionaire yourself and buy the election, you set up something much less obvious in order to route the extra funds into your election efforts. When the purpose of hiding the corruption of the core candidate is the point, because the candidate is running a supposedly uncorrupted paragon of virtue, actively hiding the Shadow Campaign like this is what you gotta do. It is a great example of a Shadow Campaign working, and working very well. But this sort of Shadow Campaign only really allows an official campaign to get around the financial limits. What about the other limits, like codes of conduct and dirty campaign practices? I'm not talking about being uncivil here. Civility politics, after all, has some serious baggage attached to it due to the use of it by centrists to try to get people they don't like to quiet down. I'm talking about engaging in unethical campaign tactics, harassment of political enemies, media manipulation, and, given we now live in a cyberpunk dystopia, manipulation of online narratives. President Trump has, of course, been the benefactor of all these things. Hell, he got impeached due to a combination of the first two, but he's been a massive benefactor of the latter due to the use of foreign and domestic disinformation campaigns and having a right-wing media alliance on his side. Hint, Fox News is a Republican Shadow Campaign, guys. It just changes the allegiance depending on who they happen to have running at the time. But these are the obvious ones, yes, including the Russian meddling. But again, it isn't the only example of these going on. What did I say about plausible deniability? If you can build a Shadow Campaign, one of the things it must be able to do is let the Prime Campaign avoid responsibility if the Shadow Campaign violates the rules, official or unofficial as they may be. Again, let us turn to recent examples of such a denial. Returning to the Sanders campaign, the other day, they released a statement condemning harassment of a union in the state of Nevada. The harassment came in the wake of the culinary union making known its displeasure of the policy of Medicare for all, just in general. As someone who supports actual universal government-run healthcare, I can say that I disagree with this union's public stance. However, instead of disagreeing with union and campaigning for what they believe, a group of Sanders supporters decided it was better to organize a targeted harassment campaign against union leadership, complete with posting of contact information and disinformation to get the faithful riled up and acting against the target. Now, some of this may have been Republican-inspired, but it's kind of hard to argue all of it was. It is good for Sanders to condemn such harassment, but isn't it weird that only his campaign seems to have had to do so? I don't mean that he's being subject to an unfair standard on this, because he's not, but in terms of Democratic candidates, only his supporters have engaged this sort of activity on a massive, predictable scale. Let's look at another recent example. Recently, a Sanders staffer was found to have produced numerous rather insulting tweets about various candidates and their campaigns. Upon discovery of this and it becoming well known, that staffer was summarily fired by the Sanders campaign. Now, this could very well have been an example of one of those bad apples that people keep talking about, despite the straight-up trollish comments coming from someone who was specifically hired by the Sanders campaign and promoted to be a regional field director. And if that was an isolated incident, then that would be the end of the story. But it wasn't. The author of the article laying out the revelations of the staffer was quickly doxxed, which means their personal information was posted online so others could make interesting use of it, and targeted by a harassment campaign himself. Thousands of text messages to his phone, a fair number being spam signups, but also absurd threats and attacks, started showing up in his inbox. What more, upon the reporter pointing out this abuse, the response has been a mix of, "Oh, that is rather terrible," and "You deserve it, man." Yeah. If this was in fact a single bad apple, an isolated incident like some of the Sanders defenders tried to argue it being, the hostile response to the original article would not have been anywhere near this aggressive, or existed at all. But instead, someone engaged in the act of speaking out about bad behavior has become a victim themselves. Meanwhile, the Sanders campaign continues forward as if none of this is going on, that none of this is connected to them at all, that they are infinitely good and would never condone such behavior, an explicit separation being demanded between the purity of the official campaign and the culture of harassment in a fraction of their supporters. Rather convenient, isn't it? The Shadow Campaign need not be made out of an official organization or titled movement. It may very well be an effort contained within a grassroots movement. A large group of people kind of moving in the same direction on some issues. There are plenty of Sanders supporters who are good people and who are working for a better tomorrow. But the silence about harassment, even by those otherwise well-meaning supporters, is telling of the culture that has been cultivated in this space. To always distrust anyone who is not on board with the campaign, to insist that they are flawed of character and thus worthy of any pain they receive, or it didn't happen at all if they did receive it. That if you question dear leader and his virtues, then this is a sign that you are part of a secret plot to stop the last hope to save America, and thus anything that happened to you either is a lie or you deserve it. This attitude has been perpetuated from the very top of the Sanders campaign, including from the candidate himself. Having reasonable critiques about the Democratic Party, the DNC, and the like are very acceptable. I've done them myself. Pushing a constant narrative where they are not just to blame for the occasional problem and bad call, but actively working against Sanders at every opportunity, specifically and exclusively, and that they were responsible for every hiccup or bad news circle, that anything that's ever gone wrong for him is their fault. All of that is just so absurd. But it convinces the faithful to take on a siege mentality, to feel like they're constantly under attack by an amorphous cabal of faceless evil, and thus anyone who they determine is acting in the interest of this faceless enemy is someone unworthy of even basic human respect. They become a target to be destroyed, and nothing more. And if you get your core supporters to take on this kind of mentality and the behavior that goes with it, they will act on it. They will seek out their perceived enemies and do what they can to harm them. And because it is now a contest between good and evil and not, say, a political campaigns involving real human beings, all of whom have flaws and strengths and, real human feelings, the Sanders campaign gets to have an autonomous attack force that is willing and eager to go after the political enemies at every opportunity, using any and all tactics to cause maximum harm, even the slightest slight, against him or his supporters. He has cultivated a shadow campaign to operate independently of his campaign for president that will work in the interest of his election while letting him claim ignorance of their activities. What more, because of that notion that Sanders, and by extension his supporters, can never do wrong, any critique of this behavior is at best denied, even when evidence is observed and documented. I suspect me pointing out this kind of obvious thing here might turn some people off. To that, though, you know what? I don't plan on being silenced on this sort of stuff, so whatever. Though, I suppose there is one good thing I could say about Sanders having multiple shadow campaigns working to support him and doing so very well. They appear to be working. Shadow campaigns often work and can be very effective. And if you are okay with targeted harassment, dark money funded candidates, and denial of these strategies being the obvious, despite the obvious evidence, then that is good news for you and the Sanders campaign. Now, I didn't make this video just to slam Sanders, of course, because he's not alone in these behaviors. Other candidates have well-funded dark money organizations supporting them. Tulsi Gabbard has long tried to create her own grassroots shadow campaign that is eager to attack her critics. If she had gotten more traction, we'd perhaps be talking about her specifically today. But Sanders is an excellent example of someone pulling off the shadow campaign strategy effectively, so effectively that he may win the nomination of the Democratic Party. The main problem, however, is that when it comes to shadow campaigns, the one he'll face the general election is about on par, if not more potent in its reach than his own. For decades now, Republicans have cultivated a network of dark money organizations and grassroots culture that is eager to harass critics while denying the most basic, obvious truths of the world due to a cultivated siege mentality that everyone is out to get them and whoever they happen to be supporting at the moment, so they gotta attack them. It is perhaps a fight fire with fire situation here, but I will say this, the Republicans have been doing this for a lot longer than Sanders has, to the point where they don't need to pretend their shadow campaigns don't exist anymore, because their base just have stopped caring at all. Corruption in the name of the Republican Party has now become a virtue and a sign of their purity as opposed to being something unacceptable. Perhaps instead of the general election, the optimal path is a strategy that fights fire with water, not fire with fire. But that's going to be hard to do when all you know is how to fight fire with fire. That said, Sanders, despite his use of his shadow campaign, has at least kept up the veneer of not using them enough to convince people that maybe he is a good guy. I'm not convinced that will hold through the general election enough to be workable, but it might. And if it does, then it works for him. But as for me, yeah, I don't buy this golly gee I'm the most good person running for a second act. But, well, sorry burners, I know any of you who may have made it this far are probably unhappy with what I had to say. So, is shadow campaigns, are they effective? Are they good to have? That depends. Not everyone has the moral flexibility to accept such unofficial efforts. Others don't give a damn about the morals, but will fight to pretend that they have them. And then still others just won't care at all, giving the blanket excuse that Republicans will have them, so why shouldn't we? Of those possibilities, at least two of them are at least being honest with you about what they're about. That have it both ways, folks, though, not a fan of that sort of thing, as you may have guessed already. So if a campaign is trying to get my vote in particular, that's not the way to go. I'll see right through it. But others are perhaps fine with that sort of tactic, and that's their choice. Just be mindful that you are making an informed decision yourself when evaluating these things, so keep a lookout for this sort of stuff. Just because someone else is fooled by a shadow campaign doesn't mean you have to be. The pretext of a shadow campaign, that they are separate from the main campaign, is after all kind of bullshit. It's an illusion. It's a big lie. But if you're okay with that big lie, for whatever reason, then by all means, endorse someone who uses them and uses them very well. If you're not okay with that, maybe it's time to look elsewhere. Which unfortunately is a little hard to do most years. Because even if the so-called paragon of all things good on the left has this kind of corruption too, maybe we're just kind of out of luck. As I've been putting this video together, been sort of working on keeping up with the news, I guess. There's a lot of stuff coming out here, and I could have talked about a number of other examples, but I came up with a couple that people were, I guess, very, aware of at the time when I started writing here. I don't want this to be just a hit job on Sanders. I don't want that at all. Though I am okay with some of the shine coming off, his campaign. The reason for that is I'm kind of done with their bullshit, so I hope you can forgive me for that at least. But if not, then whatever. We're not going to see eye to eye on this sort of stuff anyway. But if you are okay with this sort of stuff and aren't just going to try to tear my head off about it for because of a gut reaction, as you yourself have been pulled into this picture culture here, then I do invite discussion and conversation on this, because my take isn't necessarily the most correct one, so I do like to get challenged on my points and ideas here. But if you like this video and want to see more, make sure to hit the subscribe button and do the whole likes and notification bells and all the other crap. And I'll see you on my next video, be it one of these or one of my more gaming videos. My vote is coming up pretty soon here.